quadrupled graft preparation with adjustable loop devices for all inside anterior and posterior cruciate ligament reconstructions. Small steps for an optimal outcome. An autologous semitendinosus tendon is used in the surgical technique described here. Debridement of remnant muscle tissue is first performed following graft harvesting. The graft is then measured and cut to a length of 250 mm to achieve the desired folded length of 60 mm for an ACLR, with an additional 10 mm of overlapping ends for suturing. For PCLR, the desired folded length is 70 mm, and the graft thus measured accordingly to the length of 290 mm. The graft is trimmed to taper at its ends before threading it through the two loops of the adjustable loop devices to form a quadruple fold configuration. The tapered ends are then overlapped by approximately 5 mm and lightly clamped with an artery forceps. The graft is then tensioned and the length preliminarily checked to ensure that the desired length of 60 mm is achieved. The overlapped ends are then held together by placing two vertical mattress stitches with a non-absorbable suture, with the suture not facing inward and buried in the graft substance. The knotted segment is moved to the adjustable loop device loop to minimize the effect of any remaining bulk of the overlapping tapered ends. Markings are placed at 10 mm and 20 mm from each end of the graft for the placement of cerclage sutures. Cerclage sutures are placed in a sequential and unidirectional manner, starting at the first marking from one end. The suture is first threaded into the central interval of the quadrupled graft, catching as much of the graft material as possible, before exiting on one side of the graft. The suture is pulled through, and the short remnant limb is clamped with an artery forceps for stabilization. The longer limb of the suture is then threaded through as much of the graft material as possible, and exits on the opposite side of the graft. The suture is then reversed and pulled through again. The suture is thrown around the graft on one side of the artery forceps and tangent for a total of 3 throws. The suture is then threaded back into the graft substance on the side of the cerclage sutures opposite to the artery forceps to exit at the same central interval as the initial entry point where the shorter limb of the suture lies. The suture is tensioned and a minimum of 3 knots are made. The short limb of the knot is cut and the long limb is threaded through the graft and cut flush at its exit. Following placement of the first cerclage suture, the graft is tensioned to ensure equal tension and length in the remaining limbs of the graft for subsequent cerclages. Cerclage sutures are then placed at the remaining markings in a sequential manner from one end of the graft to the other, with careful attention made to tension the free loop of the graft after each cerclage suture is placed. The length and the diameter of the tubularized quadrupled graft is checked again to ensure that the desired dimensions are achieved.